Well, let's bring on one of our favorite economic analysts and thinkers here at the Hub, Ian Lee, with the Sprott School of Business. Ian, it's Liberation Day. Are you ready to be freed from I don't know 100 years of reciprocity and progress and the free exchange of people, goods, and ideas? Boy, it sounds like liberation is going to be a sweet ambrosia indeed, isn't it, sir?
Thank you for inviting me. I can't believe this. This is so surreal. We have known since Adam Smith 250 years ago that tariffs are pernicious. They're destructive. This isn't just theory. We've seen it we had the great living social experiment of the Great
Yes.
Depression. And yet tariffs didn't cause, I think there's a lot of agreement, didn't actually cause the Great Depression, but it is widely considered that it greatly exacerbated the recession and the depression, excuse me. And it doesn't require a doctorate in economics. It is a tax on your own citizens that pushes prices up. I mean, I don't know why people have so much difficulty processing that. And I'm not being flippant or sarcastic. Tariff is a tax. It raises prices across the board or on all of those products in which it is applied to. That takes money out of pockets of consumers. It takes the money out of the pockets of businesses. It drives prices up. The Bank of Canada has studied this. Many Nobel Prize laureates have studied this. It drives prices up. It reduces economic growth. Typically, it will lead to higher unemployment, which increases unemployment insurance payouts. There is no redeeming argument in economic logic, theory, or practice to support tariffs. And that's why, although I've heard this crazy argument, well, they were used for hundreds of years by governments. They were indeed until the 20th century.
Yeah.
But then we realized it was an obsolete tax, just as going to Blockbuster Video is obsolete. We don't do that. We stream and we don't write letters. We send emails or texts. And so we replaced it, much as I don't like paying taxes. We innovated the corporate income tax and the personal income tax in 1917. And then we developed consumption taxes. But this tax is the most pernicious and the most destructive of any possible tax. And so retaliatory taxes are even worse because they're pouring gasoline on the raging fire to try to put out the fire. But it doesn't put out the fire. It makes it worse.
Ian, let's steelman the argument, though, of proponents for some kind of retaliation to the Trump administration's threats and provocations. If you think that retaliatory tariffs are a bad idea, and I think it's fair to say that Rudyard and I agree with you, what, if anything, would you propose policymakers do to register our disapproval of the Trump administration's tariffs on Canadian exports?
I've talked about this extensively already. I'm writing an op-ed on this. Number one, we must get to the negotiating table. I'm very Kissingerian in the sense that, you don't end a war by starting a new bombing campaign. You don't end a trade war by announcing new tariffs. You've got to get to the only solution, the only exit ramp from a trade war, or for that matter, a military war, unless setting aside the very unique situation of the Second World War, where the two defeated enemies were surrendered unconditionally because they were bombed into the 10th century. Let's set that aside. Most military wars are ended at the negotiating table, and trade wars likewise. So first and foremost, we've got to get to a negotiated settlement. I fully understand we're going to have to open up our economy. I'm convinced of that. We're going to have to get rid of the digital services tax. We're going to have to increase spending. There's a whole bunch of things. It's not going to be easy. I'm not trying to suggest it's going to be a slam dunk. It's going to be very painful, I think, for those people in that famous Laurentian elite who developed these policies over the last 50 or 60 years that think they were so good, that I think and others think were so pernicious, protectionism and so on. But we've got to get to that's the first step. The second step is we've got to eliminate the $200 billion of interprovincial trade barriers. As Stephen Polas has said, the former governor of the Bank of Canada, that will more than offset and mitigate and eliminate the impact of Trump's tariffs. And the third thing we've got to do, forgive me, but I've been very critical for all my adult life in business school of this idea of the Laurentian elites that we're going to turn Ontario and Canada into a manufacturing superpower. And we've gone down that. I did a paper on the autopack, and I argue that the autopack was designed to save and bail out autos in southern Ontario, and it has declined since then to now. We've gone from in the top 5 or 7 to now we're 17th in the world and declining. We look at the number of cars produced, it's declining. I'm not here to declare war on auto manufacturing. We do have a comparative advantage in natural resources since before Canada was created. And so for the last many years, but especially in the last 9 years, the government under Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Guilbeault have been putting all kinds of barriers, the no pipeline bill, the tanker ban bill, in front of developing our natural resources. And the natural resources, as Professor Gordon at Laval showed in an earlier paper a few years ago, and Professor Trevor Tombe, I think I'm pronouncing his name properly, has shown at University of Calgary, that the natural resources writ large, not just oil and gas, but minerals, have been responsible for the lion's share of our increase in prosperity over the last 15, 20 years. So we've done exactly the opposite of what we should be doing. We're hamstringing our resource sector while trying to prop up a manufacturing sector that is doomed to fail very quickly, because Europe will never allow us to export cars there, neither will the Chinese. And as we're learning from Mr. Trump, he's doing the same thing too. So whether we're subsidizing Bombardier, which was guaranteed to fail because Boeing and Airbus would never allow them to take their market share, now we're subsidizing battery plants, and Trump has made it very clear he's not going to let us go in and take market share from the Americans, and neither will the Chinese, neither will the Europeans. But those same 3 countries that don't want our cars and manufactured goods, they do want our resources. So we've been going down the wrong road strategically, geopolitically, and yet we have these incredible resources under our nose. And I don't just mean oil and gas, potash, uranium, gold, agricultural products, timber. I mean, Los Angeles wants our timber to rebuild the city.
Ian, you're such a voice for clarity. We really appreciate it here at the Hub. You're part of our tribe. We love having you on here. What do you respond to, though, Ian? And this is less of an economic question, maybe more of a psychological one, is that Canadians feel insulted. They don't like this guy, okay, Mr. Trump. They feel that they've, as one of our pollsters, David Coletto, said, they feel like, they've had a second divorce here. They're, this love affair, this long-standing relationship with America has hit the rocks. And just like a lot of divorcees, recent divorcees, they're angry. And these retaliatory tariffs feel like a really satisfying equivalent of a good child custody battle. I'm going to get in there and I'm going to make that person hurt because they hurt me. So how do policymakers, how do these parties, these leaders who are running in this election now square the circle between your economic common sense and the reality that the mood in the rest of the country isn't there? It is for maximum pain, punch America in the nose.
I'm reminded by, and I think it was in his book, I hope I'm not misquoting, Halberstam, who wrote a book, The Best and the Brightest, which was a magnificent book, a reporter for the New York Times. Yeah. And he was talking about the whole Vietnam War and so on. And he talked in there at one point about the necessity on really, really critical issues that are unbelievably passionate. I mean, the Vietnam War when I was a teenager was the issue. I mean, young people were completely opposed. I was completely opposed, and older people weren't. I thought the domino theory was idiotic then. I still think it was that all the countries of the world are going to go communist if Vietnam goes communist. And Halberstam talked about the need for leadership. And I'm pretty sure he used the word followership. There's a temptation for politicians to go with the popular and go with the flow rather than get ahead and explain and lead the country on where to go. And what we have right now in Canada, I think, is a lot of followership by our national leaders and who are not getting out and using their privileged position as they have a podium. And they, the bully pulpit, as Theodore Roosevelt called it. And they can communicate to people and say, look, everybody, yes, I feel your anger. I understand your anger, but we are not going to cut off our nose to spite our face. Self-harm is not a viable public policy.
Right.
And we've got to explain this is going to hurt you. This is going to take money out of your pocket. Some of your loved ones may get laid off, and nobody thinks that that's cool. And we've got to use that kind of language, that the pain to ordinary Canadians is really profound. And we've got to channel our anger in a different and more constructive manner. I'm not hearing that from any of our leaders. And it takes courage. Sure it does. But if you say it and you keep pounding that and keep, in basic language, this is going to hurt you. And it's not going to hurt Donald Trump. He's not paying these tariffs. It's falling on all of us. And it's not a hard message to communicate. The government's bragging it's upwards towards $200 billion. What they're saying is they want to take $200 billion out of the pockets of ordinary Canadians.
Yeah.
So you'll have less money to buy food, less money to take a trip, or less money to buy a new car. Yeah. And we're not seeing that leadership at the top of our country, at the level of premiers or at the national government.
Sean, let's give you the last question, and then we'll say goodbye to Ian.
Yeah, Ian, I want you to respond to something that Theo Argyris, our economics editor-at-large, wrote last week, and that is that increasingly, in a world in which Ottawa is already running a large deficit, the different parties have made significant commitments to new fiscal outlays in the form of tax cuts and incremental expenditures, that these retaliatory tariffs are no longer merely a trade policy. They are increasingly core to how the different political parties are thinking about their fiscal plans, which is to say there are these perverse incentives that, at least in the short term, retaliatory tariffs can help them square the circle between their spending ambitions and the government's bottom line. Talk about why it's fallacy to think that retaliatory tariffs ought to be seen as a useful part of the different parties' fiscal plans.
Thank you. And that's a very important question, and I'm glad that it's finally being addressed. And the answer, I believe, is very straightforward. I've studied in the business school teaching the strategy capstone course, which studies the competitiveness of firms, industries, and the national economic policy framework. I've been doing that for 35 years. And I've always been struck by, because I study StatsCan data and Bank of Canada data all the time because it's really good data, big aggregate trend data. I've been struck in when you have an economic downturn, I'll call it a recession or just a downturn, how incredibly sensitive the government of Canada's revenues and the provincial premier, the provincial government's revenues are so sensitive. That is to say, when the economy drops, revenues crash. And so because I argue, I don't think I'm arguing, I think anybody who looks at this would realize that the tariffs are so destructive that it's going to cause a dramatic decline in GDP. And when GDP declines dramatically, it's going to cause a dramatic decline in revenues of the federal government because corporate income taxes go down. They're not making profits. They don't pay taxes. And people lose their job. They're not paying personal income taxes. And of course, on the other side, the stabilizers called unemployment insurance go up. So they get squeezed on both sides, so that those people who are sitting around counting gleefully the revenue stream that they think they're going to get from tariffs, I think are way overestimating them because A, the negative impact on the economy side, number one, that I've just described. Number two, there's going to be what Hayek, and I like Hayek for one reason, Frederick Hayek, the Nobel laureate, that consumers and businesses are infinitely adaptable. Schumpeter made this argument too, that we just don't sit there and say, that's it, I'm finished. You adapt and you innovate and you change. So people are going to be doing everything under the sun to avoid those tariffs by switching their behavior, postponing their behavior, looking for substitutes, looking for competitors, which are not the same thing. And they will be avoiding like the plague those tariffs. And so the revenue, I believe they're overestimating from tariffs. And they're underestimating the negative impact on the rapid decline of revenues flowing in to the federal and provincial governments.
Yeah, such a smart point. Ian, we got to get you back on. This is the hot issue of this campaign. You're a voice of sanity, a voice of reason in the econosphere of Laurentian capitalism. So, my friend, come back on anytime.
I would love to. Thanks very much. Really appreciate this. Thanks, Sean. And thank you, Reggie.